I did not grow up around hunting. I grew up in neighborhoods where the loudest thing at night was a motorcycle railing. Down the boulevard and the closest thing to wilderness was a city park with a duck pond and a single stubborn raccoon. So, when my best friend Wyatt invited me to spend a long weekend at his family's cabin, I said yes with something like courage and something like fear. He had been my first real friend at university, the kind you trust with the weird corners of yourself. We met in a freshman literature class, bonded over bad coffee and better sarcasm, and stayed close long after we stopped pretending we liked the cafeteria food. With Wyatt, there was never any question whether I belonged. He made room for me simply by existing, and I had learned to do the same for him. The cabin sat at the edge of a forest that felt older than the road that led to it. The gravel drive ended in a small clearing, and beyond that the trees stood in crowded ranks, trunks damp with mourning and the kind of moss that looks like velvet in the right light. When we pulled up that Friday evening, the sky had already turned bruised purple, and the air smelled like cold water and pine. The place was humble and well kept, a rectangle of dark wood with a porch half wrapped around it, a chimney that exhaled the faintest ribbon of smoke, two rocking chairs, and a rack by the door for boots caked in old mud. There was a longhorn skull hung above the doorframe, bleached almost white, but someone had tied a strip of red cloth to one horn that fluttered a little when the wind turned. Inside, the cabin felt warmer than the wood stove deserved, the sort of warmth that comes from being lived in. Framed photos lined the mantel, a boy missing his front teeth holding a sunfish, a woman smiling against a mountain backdrop, the same boy, a little older, grinning with braces and a muddy jersey. Wyatt laughed at his own history while he unpacked. He pointed out the cot where he used to sleep when the place felt too scary to be alone, the hook on the wall where his mother had made him hang his caps, the nick on the table from when he tried whittling without looking. It was a private museum, and he was the only docent who knew what each small relic meant. His father arrived later just as the night settled into itself. I had met him twice in passing, once at a graduation lunch, and once when he had swung by campus to drop off a toolbox. Jimmy Carter had the same sandy hair as Wyatt, but shot through with gray, and his face was mapped with fine lines around the eyes from years of squinting into the sun. He was broader through the shoulders, a little taller, the sort of man whose presence reshaped a room, even if he said nothing. He wore worn jeans, scuffed boots, and a quiet confidence that seemed as much a part of him as his own skin. He was a cowboy, not in the flashy rodeo sense, but in the deep bone-weary way of a man who worked the land. His hands, resting on the cooler he carried, were callous but capable, and he moved with the unhurried grace of someone who understood the rhythms of the earth. Divorce had carved a line under his eyes, the kind that never quite fades. I had heard about it in the way sons talk about things they wish they could fix. The paperwork had been signed 2 years back. Years can be both a blink and a long season. On him, it looked like both. Glad you could make it, he said, carrying a cooler to the counter like it weighed nothing. His voice had a roughness that lived in the lower notes, deepened by open air and dust, the sound of someone who did his thinking before he ever opened his mouth. Why, it's been threatening to drag you up here for a while. Threatening is a strong word, Wyatt said. Promising is more accurate. Jimmy glanced at me with the kind of fatherly fondness he probably built by accident, then turned to the wood stove. There was grace in the way he moved, controlled and practical, like every action had a purpose. It was not the grace of someone performing. It was the kind of grace that makes other people trust you in the dark. We ate simple food at the narrow table and talked about the route we would hike at first light. Wyatt outlined it with a finger on the map, tapping landmarks like a drummer finding rhythm. I listened, nodded. tried to memorize the turns and creeks, and failed in the way I always did when someone handed me a map. Mostly, I watched the two of them together. There was an ease there, a language only they spoke. They gave each other space and kept each other close. I recognized it as something I wanted for myself, and that recognition sat somewhere tender in my chest. The awkward moment came later, and I still do not know if it happened because the cabin was small or because the night was careless. We had decided on showers before sleep. Wyatt went first. I followed, grateful for heat and steam, standing under the hiss as long as I dared. When I stepped out, the light above the mirror fogged into a halo. I wrapped the thin towel around my hips, scrubbed my hair with another, and opened the door toward the hallway with the kind of lazy confidence you only have when you think you are alone. I was not alone. Jimmy stood there, hand raised to knock on the opposite end of the hall, caught mid-motion like a photograph. For one long heartbeat, we both froze. Time opened the way it does when you trip and fall and know it will hurt. I felt heat rise to my face before I felt the cool air on my skin. The towel stayed in place. Nothing was exposed beyond the body everyone knows we each have. Yet the air changed, and I knew he felt it too. "Sorry," he said, retreating a half step, voice low and surprised. "Didn't realize you were in there." "No, it's okay," I said, which is the thing you say when it is not okay. But nothing bad has happened and you want it to stay that way. I moved sideways to let him pass if he wanted. He did not. Instead, he looked down at the floor with a brief embarrassed smile, then looked up just enough to meet my eyes. The look was polite and careful, but there was a flicker inside it, as if a match had been struck and quickly cupped by a hand. "I was just going to put another log on," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the living room, with the same hand that had been lifted to knock. "Good night." "Night," I said. "Heart doing something with wings." He walked away. I stood for a few more seconds in the doorway, towel damp, hair dripping, trying to make sense of how a person can feel, both mortified and strangely seen in the exact same breath. I slipped into the small bedroom Wyatt had given me and closed the door. On the other side of the wall, I heard their voices, low and ordinary. A laugh, the soft thud of wood in the stove, the cabin settling into the quiet of old boards. I stared at the ceiling in the dim light and tried to pretend nothing had shifted. Morning unclenched the sky with a slow gray. The forest was a sleeping animal waking, breath visible in the cold. We dressed in layers. Wyatt put a rifle in a soft case, with a reverence that made me understand the gravity of the day, even if I did not share it. Jimmy handed me an orange vest and helped adjust the strap when I fumbled with it. His calloused fingers were warm. The touch lasted only as long as the adjustment required, but it settled in me like a stone dropped into deep water. "Safety first," he said. "You listen to Wyatt, he knows the trails like the back of his hand." "I will," I said when he stepped back. Air felt colder by degrees. We set out with the sun barely above the treetops. The trail was a suggestion, more than a path stitched between roots and rocks. Deer sign marked the soft mud near the creek, and Wyatt pointed it out with a patient grin, as if I were a kid he was proud to teach. The forest held a layered silence. There was the silence you think is empty, and then the silence you learn is full. Bird-stitched sound between branches. Somewhere distant, water rehearsed the same song it had sung before my grandparents were born. I took careful steps and breath like I remembered how we moved single file where the ground narrowed. Wyatt in front, me behind, Jimmy bringing up the rear. The arrangement felt practical, but it also felt like a sentence with a subject, an uncertain clause, and a period. Every now and then I could feel the heat of Jay's presence behind me, even when he was far enough back that branches swung closed between us. It would be nothing to say that I imagined it, that I was reacting to last night's embarrassment, and inventing a story around the shape of an accident. I told myself exactly that and still kept noticing. We stopped at a rise where the trees broke just enough to let the light pour down in squares. Wyatt crouched to study tracks. I stood, letting the sun dry the damp edges of my sleeves, listening to wine skip through the high boughs. Jimmy came up beside me and lifted his chin toward the eastern ridge. "Fog will burn off by 10, he said. "Good visibility after that." Nodded, grateful for something as neutral as weather. He looked at me, not down this time but directly the way people look when they are taking a measure of truth. I held his gaze for a beat longer than politeness required. There was nothing hungry in it, not yet. If anything, there was care. There was also a question, or maybe I was the one carrying it. The moment passed. Wyatt stood and led us on. We followed him, the three of us arranged again by the trail's insistence, but the uneasiness did not lift. It was not a bad feeling. Exactly. It was the tension between what I owed my friend and what new unnamed thing was asking for my attention. It was the memory of a towel in a hallway, and a voice saying good night in a tone that did not quite know where to land. It was curiosity, stirred and reluctant, the kind that makes a person look over their shoulder even when they know they should keep their eyes ahead. The hunter's rule is simple. You keep quiet. You move carefully. You notice the small signs before they swell into larger ones. I tried to do that with the forest. I tried to do it with myself. I told my pulse to slow and my steps to match Wyatt's. I told my mind to be a good house for the day we were having, not the day I was afraid might be. Waiting, still, as the trail turned and the light shifted, I could feel gravity leaning just a little toward something I could not yet name. The morning had grown into itself by the time Wyatt signaled for us to pause. The sun was higher now, spilling pale gold through the lattice of branches. Mist still clung to the hollows, curling around tree trunks as if reluctant to leave. Our breath made small ghosts in the air. The world felt held in suspension, like every sound mattered more than it usually did. The crunch of our boots on leaves seemed thunderous, so we made a ritual of silence, letting only the forest speak. Wyatt crouched a few yards ahead, studying the ground for tracks. I lingered behind, watching his hand hover over a faint depression in the soil. A hunter's patience etched into every careful movement. That patience was not mine, though I tried to mimic it. My eyes kept drifting elsewhere, to the canopy where sunlight laced itself into shifting patterns, to the way shadows rippled whenever the wind touched the branches, and most of all to the man standing near me. Jimmy had slowed his pace. He wasn't looking at the ground like Wyatt, nor at the trees like me. He was looking at me, not openly, not long enough for me to call it out, but enough that I felt it the way you feel a draft through a closed window. When Wyatt moved farther down the slope to follow the prints, John's voice came low behind me. "Walk with me for a minute." I turned, startled. His hand rested lightly on my shoulder, not firm enough to guide, not hesitant enough to be mistaken for accident. My throat tightened. "Shouldn't we stay with him?" I whispered, nodding toward Wyatt. "He'll be fine. He knows these woods." Jay's words trailed, but his expression filled in what he didn't say. He needed something. Reluctantly, I followed as he stepped off the main path. The forest closed around us, quieter somehow, though the same birds called overhead. Branches brushed my sleeves. The air smelled sharper here, damp earth, crushed pine. Each step deepened the sense of being away from the world, away from Wyatt. My pulse stumbled between fear of being lost and fear of what this detour meant. When we stopped, it was in a small clearing ringed by birch. John removed his cap, rubbed the back of his neck, and exhaled as though the breath had been waiting for years. His face looked harder in the morning light, but his eyes softened with something fragile, something I wasn't used to seeing in him. "I need to say this," he began. voice low but steady. And I don't expect you to agree or even understand, but I can't keep carrying it in silence. I waited stiff, uncertain. You know, I've been divorced 2 years now, he said. The words felt heavy, carved from stone. That house hasn't had laughter in it since. Some nights it feels like I walk into rooms that are already empty. Even when I'm standing right there, loneliness gets in your bones. It eats at you when you're not looking. He stopped, swallowed hard, then went on. And lately, I've realized how much I notice you. My heart kicked hard in my chest. I thought I must have misheard him. My ears burned with cold and shock. I shouldn't have seen you last night, he said quickly, his eyes darting toward mine, then away again. That wasn't planned, but the truth is I'd already noticed before. The way you listen when Wyatt talks, the way you carry yourself. There's a kindness in you and something else, something I can't seem to turn away from. I stared at him, words jammed in my throat. My mind splintered into questions, into warnings. He's your friend's father, he's twice your age, this is wrong. But beneath that chorus was another voice, quieter but insistent. He sees you, he means this. You don't have to say anything, Jimmy murmured. I just needed you to know because holding it back any longer feels like lying, and I've had enough lies in my life. The air between us vibrated with unspoken weight. I should have stepped back, should have put distance between us, should have said no. That would have been the safe thing, the loyal thing, but I couldn't move. I was pinned between disbelief and the strain pull of being wanted by someone I was not supposed to want in return. Finally, I found words. Do you realize what you're saying, who I am, who your son is to me? I do. His reply was immediate, firm, and that's why I fought myself on it for months. You think I don't know how this sounds, that I haven't told myself 100 times to bury it. But then I look at you, and it's like the part of me that's been numb for years starts to feel again. I can't apologize for that, only for the fact that it complicates everything. Silence stretched. A crow cut across it from somewhere high, skull rough as broken wood. I pressed my palm against a tree trunk to steady myself. Bark rough under my skin. My thoughts ran in circles. Loyalty to Wyatt, who trusted me without question. Curiosity sharp and burning about what it meant to be desired by a man like Jimmy. The ache of knowing I craved connection too. Craved it so deeply I sometimes pretended not to. I heard myself whisper, almost against my own will. Why me? Jimmy looked at me then, full and unflinching. Because you carry gentleness like it's strength. Because you're not afraid to be real. Because when I look at you, I don't feel like a man left behind. I feel like someone who still has something to give. The confession sat between us like a fire we hadn't lit but now had to tend. My chest tightened, unsure whether with fear or with something dangerously close to longing. I don't know what to do with this, I admitted. You don't have to do anything, he said softly, just know it's there, that I'm here. Whatever you feel, even if it's nothing, I needed you to hear me say it. Wyatt's voice echoed faintly from down the slope, calling about a trail of tracks. The spell cracked. I stepped back, nodding quickly, though my mind was anything but settled. Let's get back, I said. My voice shook. Jimmy replaced his cap, nodded once, and together we walked toward the sound of Wyatt's voice. The woods closed behind us like nothing had happened, but everything had. As we rejoined Wyatt, who grinned and pointed out the deer sign with excitement, I forced my face into something neutral. Inside, though, I carried a storm. The clash of loyalty and temptation, fear and an undeniable pull. What had begun as a hunting trip was already turning into something I didn't have words for, and I wasn't sure whether to pray it would end quickly or hope it wouldn't end at all. The rest of the morning passed in fragments I could hardly remember. Wyatt walked ahead, pointing out trails of deer prints and bent twigs, as if the forest itself whispered only to him. I nodded when I should, forced small smiles, and tried to keep my boots from crunching too loudly on the undergrowth. But inside me there was a steady hum, a storm muffled under my ribs. Every time I felt Jay's presence behind me, I was pulled back to the clearing, to his voice telling me things I never thought I would hear. When Wyatt finally decided to head back to camp for lunch, I almost sagged in relief. We trudged toward the cabin, our breaths mixing with the cold air. Just before we reached the porch, Wyatt handed me his rifle case. "I'm going to chop some firewood before it gets dark," he said. "You two go ahead." I wanted to protest, to say I'd help to avoid what I knew was coming, but Jimmy caught my eye. The briefest flicker of intention there, and I felt the ground tilt beneath me. Inside, he set his cap on the counter and leaned against the table, arms folded as though steadying himself. The silence stretched. Finally he spoke, voice low and stripped bare. "When my wife left," he said, "I thought the hardest part would be the paperwork, the lawyers, the signatures, the dividing of a life into columns, but that wasn't it. The hardest part was walking into a house every night that used to be full of noise." The absence became louder than any argument we'd ever had. At first, I told myself I didn't care, that I could live on my own just fine. But months turned into years, and I realized I'd been living half a life. I stood there unsure what to do with my hands. "I'm sorry," I said softly, because it felt like the only safe thing to say. He gave a small, humorless laugh. "Don't be. Some things end because they have to, but endings don't heal you. They just remind you of what's missing." His eyes searched mine, and I felt pinned by the weight of his honesty. And then last night happened. Heat flooded my cheeks. I looked away at the floorboards, worn smooth with years of boots, at the wood stove crackling in the corner. Anything but his gaze. "I wasn't supposed to see you like that," he continued, his voice rougher now. "But when I did, it stirred something in me I thought was gone. Not just desire, though God knows that was part of it, but a reminder that I could feel it all. That my body and my heart weren't dead things just going through motions." I swallowed hard. My chest rose and felt like I'd run a mile. My instinct was to shut it down, to tell him it was wrong, that Wyatt was my friend and this could ruin everything. And yet underneath the panic, another truth whispered, because I had been lonely too, not the same kind of loneliness as his. Mine came with youth, with trying to figure out where I belonged and who could ever want me. But it was loneliness all the same. And beneath it was the ache I rarely admitted to anyone, the longing to be wanted, wholly and unashamed. I thought of all the times I had told myself I was meant to give more than to take, meant to carry weight rather than wield it. I had always known my heart leaned toward yielding, toward being held instead of holding, toward being chosen and guided. To be the one cared for, not because I was weak, but because there was healing in surrender. And here stood a man who, with a single confession, had made me feel like maybe there was nothing broken in that. I lifted my eyes to him. "You don't know what you're asking," I whispered. His expression softened, shadows shifting across the lines on his face. "I'm not asking anything you don't want to give. I'd never force you into something that hurts you. I just need you to understand where I am and what I feel when I'm near you." The room felt too small. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, loud as a drum. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with tension, with the unspoken truth that something had shifted between us and could not be undone. Finally, I stepped closer, not enough to close the distance fully, but enough to show I wasn't running away. My voice trembled when I spoke. "I've always wanted to be wanted, to be seen, to have someone look at me the way you just did." Jimmy's chest rose sharply, as if he'd been holding his breath. "I don't know if this is right," I added quickly. "Wyatt is my friend. He trusts me. If he knew," my words faltered, "he doesn't have to know Right now, Jimmy said gently, what matters is what's happening here between us. You don't have to decide everything today. Just don't close the door. The weight of his gaze pressed against me. Not demanding, but steady like an anchor offered in stormy water. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady the chaos inside me. The truth was, I didn't want to walk away. I didn't want to tell him no. When I opened them again, I gave a small shaky nod. I won't close it. Relief washed over his features. Relief. And something deeper, something almost tender. For a man who looked carved from stone, it was startling to see such raw vulnerability flicker there. We stood in that fragile stillness, the air thick with everything unsaid. Neither of us reached out, not yet, but the acceptance had begun to root itself in me, hesitant but undeniable. I didn't know where it would lead or how we would survive the cost of it. All I knew was that I couldn't pretend anymore that his confession had left me untouched. The fire popped in the stove, breaking the moment like a clock ticking back into motion. Outside, I heard Wyatt's axe split wood, each strike distant but steady. Life continued, ordinary as ever, and yet for me, nothing was ordinary anymore. Inside, I carried a dangerous new truth. I was no longer just Wyatt's friend on a hunting trip. I was someone who had been chosen, seen by his father, and despite the fear, a fragile seed of longing had begun to grow inside me. The afternoon wore on in quiet fragments. Wyatt busied himself outside with the pile of wood, his rhythm steady, a kind of song against the silence of the forest. Inside, I pretended to help with small tasks, tidying the table, folding the extra blankets, checking the kettle, though it didn't need checking. Anything to keep my hands busy, to mask the chaos inside me. John moved with the same quiet efficiency, but I felt him near in every breath. Every time our eyes almost met, I looked away too quickly. Every time his shoulder brushed mine in the narrow space between stove and counter, my chest tightened. The air between us was no longer neutral. It carried the weight of all that had been confessed and the ache of what remained unsaid. At last, Wyatt announced he was taking a walk to scout another ridge, leaving his rifle propped by the door. I'll be back before dark, he said casually, shouldering his pack. He didn't notice the way my stomach flipped at the thought of being left alone with his father. The door closed. The cabin fell into a silence broken only by the stove's steady crackle. I turned and Jimmy was watching me, not with the guarded caution of before, but with something deeper, more open, more certain. You're nervous, he said gently. I laughed short and strained. Is it that obvious? His lips curved, but his eyes stayed serious. Only because I feel the same. He stepped closer and my pulse stuttered. I don't want to push you. You should know that. I swallowed hard, words sticking in my throat. It's not that I don't want to. It's that I'm afraid of what it means. Afraid of being caught. Afraid of everything. Jimmy's hand lifted slowly, deliberately, until his fingers rested just against my forearm. The warmth of his skin was startling in its simplicity. I've been afraid too, he admitted. Afraid of being alone forever. Afraid of needing something I thought I'd lost the right to ask for. But then you made me remember what it feels like to want. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let my eyes meet his. And for the first time, I didn't look down. I let him see me. The part of me that ought to be chosen, to be wanted without condition. I don't know if I'm enough, I whispered. His hand moved to cup my cheek, rough palm tender against my skin. You're more than enough. You're exactly what I didn't know I needed. Something inside me gave way then, like a door creaking open after being locked too long. My hesitation wasn't gone, but it was no longer stronger than the pull between us. I leaned into his touch and he closed the distance, pressing his lips softly to mine. It wasn't urgent, not at first. It was careful, searching, as though we both knew the fragility of what we were doing. My body trembled with nerves, but his steadiness anchored. Me, the kiss deepened slowly, carrying with it years of his loneliness and the raw, secret ache of my own. When we finally broke apart, our foreheads rested together, breaths mingling. We shouldn't, I murmured, even as I leaned closer again. No, he agreed, his voice low and rough, but sometimes the heart doesn't care about should. The rest unfolded not in rushed hunger, but in quiet surrender. His hands guided without force, asking permission in every movement. I answered in nods, in whispers, in the way I let myself follow. There were moments of clumsy laughter, nerves tripping over themselves, but those only made the tenderness sharper. We didn't need to speak the roles aloud. They revealed themselves in the way he studied me, in the way I leaned into his certainty. I let go of the weight I always carried, the need to prove, to resist, to hide, and found a strange healing peace in being held and yielding. It wasn't about power, it was about trust. Time blurred. The cabin became a world of its own. Shut off from the forest, from Wyatt, from consequence. There was only the warmth of the fire, the rasp of his voice murmuring my name, the press of his arms around me as if he feared I might vanish if he let go. At some point, the light outside shifted, turning the cabin windows to sheets of gold. I lay against him, heart still racing, body trembling with the aftershocks of everything we hadn't dared name. He smoothed a hand through my hair, breathing deep and steady, as though the simple act of closeness filled something hollow in him. I haven't felt this alive in years, he whispered. His voice cracked on the last word, and it startled me. The vulnerability of it, the nakedness that went deeper than anything physical. I closed my eyes, letting the truth sink into me either. For a while we stayed like that, two people who had been strangers in most ways, but were now bound by something neither of us had expected. I thought of the risks, the way Wyatt's trust hung over us like a fragile branch, the way the world outside would never understand. Fear tugged at me sharp and insistent, but when John's arms tightened around me, when his heartbeat thudded steady against my ear, fear loosened its hold. For the first time in a long while I felt seen, not as someone pretending, not as someone hiding, but as someone allowed to be exactly who I was. "We'll have to be careful," I said finally, pulling back just enough to meet his eyes. His gaze held mine with unwavering steadiness. "I know, but some things are worth the risk." I searched his face for any trace of doubt. There was none, only resolve and the kind of quiet hope that comes from a man who thought hope had abandoned him. I nodded slowly. "Then I'm not closing the door." His smile was small but real, softening the lines of his face. He kissed my forehead, lingering there, as if sealing a promise neither of us had fully spoken. Yet the fire popped again, louder this time, startling me back into the reality that the world hadn't stopped just because we had. Wyatt would return. Life would press in with all its questions and dangers, but for now, in this fragile, stolen moment, I let myself believe. We sat together in silence, hands still entwined as the shadows grew longer outside the cabin walls. And though fear still lingered at the edges of my mind, it was outshone by something I hadn't expected to find here of all places, the possibility of healing, and the daring hope that love, complicated, forbidden, undeniable, had found me where I least expected it. The walk back into the woods the next morning felt different. On the surface, nothing had changed. We carried packs, rifles, and thermoses of lukewarm coffee, our boots sinking into the soft earth in the same rhythm as before. Wyatt walked ahead of us, humming tunelessly as he scanned the terrain for movement. To him, it was another day in the quiet forest, another chance to track deer and test his patience. But for me, everything was different. Weight of what had happened in the cabin pressed against my chest, like another layer of clothing I couldn't peel off. Guilt and exhilaration weared inside me with every step. I had never felt so Alive, so wanted, so seen as I had in Jay's arms. Yet every time I looked at Wyatt's back, broad and steady, just a few paces ahead, my stomach clenched. With dread, he had no idea what had unfolded while he split logs, no idea that the world he thought safe and ordinary had been quietly rewritten behind his back. I caught John's gaze. Once as we paused to check a patch of ground. His eyes carried the same weight as mine, knowledge heavy with danger and promise. He gave the smallest shake of his head, a silent plea for patience. And I nodded, though the knot in my chest only grew tighter. Later that afternoon, Wyatt headed down toward stream to refill water bottles, leaving me and his father by the campfire's dying embers. The silence between us was thick. I could feel the words pushing at my throat, desperate to be spoken. I can't keep this from him forever, I said finally, my voice low. John glanced toward the trees where Wyatt had disappeared, then back at me. His jaw tightened before he spoke. I know, but if we tell him now in the middle of this trip, it could blow everything apart. We need time to be sure of what this is before we risk losing him. His words made sense, but they didn't quiet the unease in me. He's my best friend, he trusts me. What if this feels like betrayal to him? John sighed, running a hand over his face. It might, but hiding. It doesn't mean we're betraying him. It means we're protecting him until we can find the right way. Do you understand the difference? I wanted to believe that patience was kindness, but my heart beat faster with the thought of Wyatt's face if he ever discovered the truth on his own. Secrets had a way of poisoning trust, and Wyatt deserved better than that from me. Still, I swallowed my protest. Okay, I said softly. For now, relief flickered across Jay's features, and his hand brushed mine. Briefly, a touch so subtle it could have been mistaken for accident. It wasn't. It was his way of reminding me that even in silence, the bond between us was real. The days that followed blurred into a strange mixture of routine and quiet torment. We rose early, followed deer tracks, sat in hushed stillness under the trees. To Wyatt, it was the hunting trip he had promised me. Lessons in patience, in reading the language of the woods, in breathing so quietly even the wind didn't notice you. He was proud to teach me, and I did my best to absorb it, though my thoughts kept wandering. Every time I crouched beside him to study a print in the dirt, I wondered what he would think if he knew what his father and I shared. Every time we returned to the cabin and I saw John remove his jacket or rake his hand through his hair, heat coiled low in my chest and shame followed swiftly after. The guilt wasn't constant, came in waves. Sometimes I laughed with Wyatt around the fire and felt almost normal again, as though the secret weren't eating a hole inside me. But at night, lying in the narrow bed with the shadows pressing close, I replayed every touch, every whispered word, every moment of surrender. And in those moments, the guilt twisted with something else. Longing. One evening after Wyatt had gone to bed early, I found myself sitting on the porch, staring at the stars pricked bright above the treetops. Jimmy joined me quietly, lowering himself into the chair beside mine. We didn't speak for a while. The forest was alive with night sounds. Crickets, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the occasional owl calling from deep in the dark. Finally, I broke the silence. I don't know what this is supposed to mean. John leaned back, his face shadowed but his eyes reflecting faint light. It means we've both found something we didn't expect, something we needed. I shook my head. But is it love or just loneliness? You said yourself, you've been empty since the divorce. Maybe I'm just filling a space. His reply was steady. Do you think I'd risk my son's trust, my own peace, for something as shallow as that? No, it's more than loneliness. It's the way I feel when you walk into a room. The way I feel when I look at you and remember I still have a heart that can beat faster. His words sank into me heavy and warm, and in the quiet that Followed, I realized something I hadn't dared to name. I wanted love, but not the kind that burned fast and faded. I wanted the kind that healed, the kind that steadied. And what frightened me most was that with Jimmy, I felt closer to that than I ever had before. That night, as I lay awake listening to Wyatt's soft snores from the other room, I turned the word over and over in my head, healing. It struck me that healing wasn't always clean or simple. Sometimes it came in unexpected shapes, at inconvenient times. Sometimes it looked like a man twice my age sitting across from me in the half-dark, admitting that he had been broken and that somehow, without planning it, I had made him feel whole again. And what about me? I had spent so long telling myself I was fine, that I didn't need to be chosen, that I could survive without anyone seeing me for who I was. But the truth was I had craved it, craved being wanted, craved the safety of someone strong enough to hold me, tender enough to let me rest. In his arms I had found a glimpse of that. The guilt was still there, yes, sharp and insistent, but tangled within it was something undeniable, the sense that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of the love and healing I'd been searching for without even realizing it. As the fire in the stove burned low and the night wrapped itself around the cabin, I closed my eyes and whispered into the dark, "Don't let me regret this." The forest didn't answer, but somewhere in the silence I felt a flicker of hope. Fragile, dangerous, and impossible to ignore. The decision didn't come easily. For days we danced around it, John urging patience, me insisting that silence felt like betrayal. The secret had grown too heavy, pressing into every glance, every shared laugh with Wyatt. It wasn't fair to him and it wasn't fair to us either. So, one evening, as the sun sank low and painted the clearing in bruised golden fire, I told Jimmy the first couldn't carry it any longer. He didn't argue this time. He only nodded, jaw tight, and said, "Then, well, tell him together." My chest tightened at the word. Together, it sounded like solidarity, like bravery, borrowed from him. And yet, it also terrified me because if Wyatt couldn't accept this, if he turned away, then together might be all John and I had left, and it would come at the cost of the only friendship that had ever felt like home to me. We found Wyatt by the fire pit outside the cabin. He'd finished stacking the last of the chopped wood, and now sat hunched on a log, sharpening his knife with rhythmic strokes. Sparks glowed faint in the fire's heart, waiting to be fed. The woods were already growing dark at the edges, as if the night leaned in to listen. John stood beside me for a moment, steady as a tree, then cleared his throat. "Wyatt," he said, his voice even but quieter than usual, "we need to talk." Wyatt glanced up, brows raised. "Sounds serious." His gaze shifted between us, curiosity flickering. "What's going on?" The silence that followed felt like a chasm. My mouth was dry, my heart beat so loud I was sure they both heard it. Jimmy gave me a small nod, the kind that said, "You're not alone." I took a breath that trembled on the way out. "There's something I need to tell you." "We both do." Wyatt set the knife down slowly, his expression sharpening in a different way now. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "All right, I'm listening." The fire popped, the forest hummed around us, and then the truth spilled out, not eloquent, not polished, just raw and halting. I told him about the silence that had grown between his father and me, the confessions in the woods, the way I had found myself seen and wanted in a way I hadn't expected. I confessed that I hadn't planned it, hadn't even known how to stop it once it began. Jimmy's voice joined mine, steady but soft. He admitted his loneliness, his mistakes, and the way seeing me had cracked something open in him he thought was sealed forever. "I know this is the last thing you expected from me," he said, his eyes fixed on his son, "and I wouldn't risk saying it if it wasn't the truth." When our voices faded, the silence grew unbearable. Wyatt just sat there staring at the flames. My stomach churned with dread. I waited for anger, for betrayal, for his voice to shatter. The night with rage. Instead, he exhaled slowly and shook his head with something. Like disbelief, I knew something was going on. The words hit me harder than. If he'd yelled, you knew. Not exactly, Wyatt said, eyes flicking toward me. Then his father, but I felt it. The way you looked at each other, the quiet between you wasn't ordinary. I didn't want to believe it at first. I thought I was imagining it, but I guess I wasn't. My throat closed. Wyatt, I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. You're my best friend. I held up a hand, stopping me. Don't. Just don't apologize like you've committed a crime. I'm not blind and I'm not 12 years old. Do I like knowing my dad and my best friend have been sneaking around behind my back? No, that stings. But he paused, rubbing his thumb against his palm, searching for words. I also see the way you both look. Lighter when you're near each other. And Dad, I haven't seen you smile like that in years. Jay's face tightened with something like shame but also pride. Wyatt cut him off gently. I'm not saying this is easy. It's not. It's weird as hell, honestly. But if this is real, if it's more than a passing thing, then maybe I should stop thinking of it as betrayal and start thinking of it as unexpected. The tension inside me broke all at once, like a rope pulled too tight, snapping free. My eyes stung and I blinked hard against it. You don't hate me? Wyatt's gaze softened in a way that reminded me of the boy I'd met years ago, the one who made room for me. Without question, no, I could never hate you. You've been my brother in all the ways that matter. And if what you need now is my acceptance of this, then I'll find a way to give it. The fire crackled between us, and for the first time in days I let myself breathe fully. Later, as the three of us sat in silence, Wyatt stood and stretched. I'm turning in early, he said, his tone casual. You two take your time out here. I caught the deliberate pause, the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't mocking or bitter, it was permission. John's eyes followed his son until the cabin door closed behind him. Then he looked at me, and for the first time the fear in his expression gave way to something steadier. He gave us space, I whispered, still stunned. He gave us his blessing, Jimmy said, voice thick. In his own way, relief swept over me like cool water, washing away the worst of the guilt I'd carried. My friendship wasn't broken. Love hadn't destroyed trust. It had, against all odds, expanded it. I leaned back against Jay's shoulder, feeling his arms slip around me. The night air was cool, the fire warm, and for the first time since this all began, I believed we could build something real. Maybe it wouldn't be easy. Maybe people wouldn't understand, but we weren't hiding anymore, and that made all the difference. When I finally went to bed that night, I whispered into the dark a truth that no longer felt dangerous but freeing. I was chosen and I chose back, and the people who mattered most still stood beside me, and in that fragile, impossible peace, I fell asleep knowing love was allowed to grow here. It's strange how quickly something impossible can begin to feel ordinary. Weeks had passed since that night by the fire, and the air around us had settled into a new rhythm. Different, yes, but not broken. Wyatt never brought up the subject again, at least not directly. He teased us occasionally with a glance or by making himself scarce at just the right times. But there was no bitterness in him. If anything, he seemed relieved. Maybe because he saw his father healing, or maybe because he trusted me enough to know I wouldn't walk into something reckless without meaning it. And Jimmy, he was different too, not in the way he carried himself outwardly. He still moved with quiet purpose, still spoke with that low voice that carried weight even in silence. But inside he seemed lighter. His laughter came easier, and sometimes when he looked at me I saw a softness that hadn't been there before. A man who had spent years locked in loneliness was finally letting himself live again. For me, the change was quieter but deeper. For so long I had lived with an ache I couldn't quite name, a longing to be wanted, to belong. Now I found myself waking each morning with the simple, astonishing knowledge that I was seen, that I was cared for. Not because of what I could give or what mask I wore, but simply because I was me. There was a peace in that realization I hadn't thought possible. The cabin became our place of reckoning and renewal. On weekends I returned, with Wyatt and Jimmy, the three of us falling into an easy pattern. During the day, Wyatt and I still joked like brothers, arguing about which trails to take or who made the better fire. At night, when the shadows deepened and the woods hushed into stillness, Jimmy would sometimes reach for my hand under the table, his thumb brushing against mine. Like a promise, the secrecy was gone now, and that alone made every small touch feel brighter, freer. Wyatt knew. He didn't flinch when he saw it. He didn't turn away. His quiet acceptance was its own kind of gift, one I would never take for granted. There were still doubts, of course, questions about what people outside these woods might say if they knew, but here in this place, tucked away from the world, love was simple, real enough. One evening near the end of summer, the three of us sat together by the campfire at the edge of the woods. The flames licked skyward, sparks dancing into the dusk. The forest stretched around us like a cathedral, branches arching high and shadows shifting with the fire light. Wyatt leaned back on a log, his knife busy whittling a small piece of wood into something shapeless but steady. He looked calm, content in the rhythm of the moment. John sat beside me on the ground, his arm warm and solid around my shoulders. The weight of it was grounding, steadying, as if to remind me that no matter how uncertain life could be, here was something I could trust. For a long time, none of us spoke. Fire cracked, an owl hooted from deep in the trees, and the night gathered itself around us. Finally, Wyatt broke the silence. "You know," he said, glancing at us with a faint smile, "I never thought I'd be the third wheel on my own hunting trip." I froze for half a second, unsure whether he was joking or serious. Then his grin widened and John let out a rare laugh. The sound rippled through the night, warm and unguarded. Wyatt's eyes softened. "But I meant it when I said I don't hate this. You're both happier, and if you're happy, then so am I." My chest tightened, gratitude rising like a tide. "Thank you," I said quietly. "I don't know what we would have done if you..." He cut me off with a shrug. "You don't owe me anything. Just don't make me listen to you two being sappy all the time." We all laughed then. Kind of laughter that lifts something heavy from the air. And in that moment I realized the truth. Love didn't have to tear things apart, could knit them together in ways you never expected. Later, as the fire burned low and the woods hushed into deeper silence, I leaned into Jimmy's side, his arms still around me. His presence was solid, unshakable. For the first time in my life, I wasn't restless, I wasn't searching, I wasn't wondering whether I was enough. I was simply here, I thought. Back to the beginning, to the awkwardness of the towel in the hallway, to the tension in the clearing, to the night spent tangled in guilt and fear. I thought about how far we'd come since then, how something that once seemed unthinkable had grown into something undeniable. I came here just for a hunting trip, I whispered to myself, eyes fixed on the glowing embers, but I left with a place where I finally belonged. John squeezed my shoulder as if he'd heard me. Wyatt looked up from the fire, smiling faintly in the flickering light, and for the first time I believed that maybe the world, even with all its rules and judgments, could make room for a love like this. And now, as I share this story, I want to ask you, because stories don't end when the telling does. They live in the hearts of the ones who hear them. What would you have done if you were in my place? Would you have followed your heart, even if it meant falling for your friend's father? Thanks for watching.